So good morning, everybody. Yes, I was asked to talk to you about the reconstruction of historic garden and talk a little bit on period design and plants. I will do so and then reflect back to our garden, Paleis Het Loo, just to show a little bit like how it's been incorporated. So I don't know if you know, but the reconstruction and the renovation of gardens is only since 1981 addressed in the Florence Charter of the International Council on Monuments and Sites, in where it is recognized as an architectural and horticultural composition. That's very important, also including like its design, so its plan and its topography, its vegetation, but that also includes its species, proportions, color scheme, spacing, and specific height. So also the rhythm within your planting schemes is part of the monument that is the garden. Its structural and decorative features, so it's also including all statues, follies, whatever is included in your garden. And of course, there's an important role for its water, running or still reflecting the sky. So monumental garden, historic gardens are a testimony to a culture, a style, an age, and often also the originality of a creative artist. So if we start with looking at the period, so if you have a specific garden, you want to have a renovation, most of the gardens, of course, have now different historical layers. So depending on its history, depending on the owners, it changed through time with garden fashions and the taste of the owners. But if you want to have a renovation, there is this choice which period you emphasize on if you're going to renovate a garden. And of course, part of it is the strategy of the organization, like especially if it's a larger organization, say the English Heritage. I mean, there are a lot of different gardens incorporated in the organization, and then it's very important to look at diversity and uniqueness. If a certain garden has, for instance, a layer of capability brown design, or an older layer that goes back even perhaps to medieval times, which layer will have main emphasis? And it's good to also emphasize then uniqueness. And a third point, also not very unimportant, are of course the available resources. And that's not only resources to carry out a large renovation project, but it's also afterwards having enough resources to have the maintenance and to maintain the garden on a level that's necessary for the specific garden. And I think especially that last part is sometimes overlooked. Then there's a lovely budget to renovation, but afterwards there's not enough budget to really employ the gardens with the skill to be able to maintain the garden. But so looking at, for instance, then Paleis Het Loo. For Paleis Het Loo, Wilhelmina was the last royal occupant of the Het Loo Palace. So after her death in 1962, it was decided to turn Paleis Het Loo to a museum dedicated to the history of the Orange-Nassau family, so the royal family. And the rather rigorous choice was made to bring house and garden back into its 17th century origins. So at the end of the 17th century, Paleis Het Loo was built by William III, at that point stadhouder of the Dutch Republic, and his English wife, Mary Stuart II. They were looking for a new place to build a country estate. They already owned a few that were given to them by William's grandparents, but they wanted to really build their own country estate with a new paradisic garden in the latest fashion, a Baroque garden. And they looked particularly at the Veluwe, so the center part of the Netherlands, because William already had all hunting rights for this area. And they decided on this location in the middle of Apeldoorn, next to the medieval castle Het Loo, which you can see in the left upper corner. And they chose specifically for this location because it already had a lot of fresh running water at the location due to a relatively low position in combination to the surrounding hills of the Veluwe. So there was enough water to really be able to establish a beautiful green, lush, paradisic garden in an area that was more rather rough moorland when they started building there. So then the question was, what was known on the design? Normally, if you look at the design, you can use contemporary paintings and design sketches. If you have any, if you're lucky, there are good accounts in travel reports. And sometimes if you know the garden architect and the designer, you can also have a look at other projects of this same garden architect. Looking at the 17th century for the situation of Paleis Het Loo, we know that the house was built by Jacob Roman as the building architect, but for the garden we now think it was actually created by a co-creation team consisting of Hans Willem Bentinck, who was the first Earl of Portland and a very close friend of William, but also himself a very keen gardener. There was Daniel Desmarais, who was the superintendent of all princely gardens in the Netherlands. You had Jacob Roman, so the building architect, and Romein de Hooge. And Romein de Hooge was also an architect, but also a draftsman. He painted a lot of, so he was more or less like the spin doctor for William to really show his wealth and his knowledge. And Romein de Hooge designed the symbolic meaning of the garden. So symbolic meaning in all aspects, as the statues, the fountains, everything. And this group of men as a co-creation created the gardens of Het Loo. And Romein de Hooge also made a lot of beautiful pictures of the garden. So here we see, for instance, the two privy gardens. So on the left-hand side, we have Mary's privy garden, which included all special, just introduced exotic plants that Lenneke just told about, so at the end of the 17th century. And on the right-hand side, we see William's privy garden with a specific area in front in which he could play at an old-fashioned time of croquet. We call it klos, with his friends in his private garden. So, but it's not only the real thing you see on those contemporary designs and drawings. This is, for instance, also a view to the back of the palace, also by Romein de Hooge. But if we look clearly, we see everything is just a little bit bigger than life. If you look at the height of the figures compared to, for instance, the large entrance in the middle towards the palace, it looks like the entrance is twice as high, but actually they're just, the entrance is just a little bit above the head of the person. So everything is enlarged, everything shows bigger and even more wealthy than it used to be. I have to go back, I think. Something went. Okay. So, and there are two real design sketches that are still available of Paleis Het Loo. So first is on your left-hand side is by Van Staden. And the right-hand one is one that was discovered actually in 2003 in former East Germany. And you can see that the general layout, although looks very similar, there are a lot of differences. So what really is the truth. It's sometimes based on design sketches, very hard to decide on what was the original layouts. Well, this was the situation Paleis Het Loo was in the moment that this decision was made to bring it back into its 17th century starting point. At that point in time, it had a white facade. It was plastered with white on the outside, and the park was and garden was completely a landscape park. This situation started at the end of the beginning of the 19th century, actually when the Netherlands had a French king, Louis Napoleon, the brother of Napoleon, who ruled the Netherlands in the beginning of the 19th century. And he plastered the palace on the outside, and he just covered the Baroque garden with an enormous layer of sand, approximately 80 centimeters. So by the time they started digging in the garden to bring back the original Baroque garden that was there, they found, well, let's say the hardware of the garden completely still there. So they found the remnants of all the different fountains, the waterways, even the corners of the hedges were found as dark imprints in the soil, still present in the soil. Meaning that for Paleis Het Loo, we know exactly what was the design, what was the features and the dimensions of our garden. So we could use exactly the exact location of the waterways, of the fountains, to bring back that 17th century Baroque garden in design. And in 1984, it opened as a museum looking like this, in which the fountains, the corners of the parterres, the walkways, everything is in the dimensions as it was when it disappeared under this enormous layer of sand. But the focus for this webinar is on plants. What do we know on the plants that were grown in this garden in the 17th century? Well, of course, there is a general question of what plants were available in this period. Lenneke before me already explained a little bit on what we know, what was there, what was coming in from the different areas. But in general, if you work, for instance, with a landscape park shaped by Capability Brown, is there a specific set of plants, of trees that were almost always used by a specific designer? Do you know anything on preferred favorite plants? And if you're lucky, there are some reports on plants that are encountered in travel reports. If you're even more lucky, you will find plant inventories or order accounts with plants and seeds ordered by the different breeders. And what you can also use is, especially also in our case, is what I would call circumstantial evidence. So knowing which part of the social network also had gardens, and in which you can assume that those plants were also available in the garden you're trying to reconstruct. And another source, for me, important source of knowledge about the plants you can use is the use of contemporary herbaria. So in the case, again, for Paleis Het Loo, we're very lucky. There are no plant lists, there are no inventories. There is a very small inventory, 1713, of a few adult plants that are in a greenhouse at that point. But we don't know exactly what was applied in the gardens, what plants were there. But we are lucky that when William and Mary became the King and Queen of England, Scotland and Wales in 1689, Mary went to England and was never able to come back to the Netherlands. But she really wanted to know how Paleis Het Loo was enlarged and how the gardens was looking after she left. So she asked Walter Harris, who was the physician of William, who accompanied William always to his travels to the Netherlands, to give her a report on how the garden looked like. And he reports on all aspects on how the garden looks like, all the statues, but he also gives very detailed descriptions like this one, saying that in the beds and parterres of this and the other gardens are not only provided with pyramids of juniper and yew and with marshmallow shrubs of all colors, but they also contain in spring a variety of the most beautiful tulips, hyacinths, ranunculus, auriculas, daffodils. And in summer, we have double poppies in all kinds of colors, wallflowers, delphiniums. In autumn, sunflowers, nasturtiums, hollyhocks, marigolds. And we also know that against the walls of these gardens grow a selection of the best fruit, such as the best peaches, apricots, cherries, pears, figs, plums, muscat grapes, and all kinds of varieties. So it tells us that Het Loo in the 17th century worked with a separate spring planting with all kinds of bulbs, annuals, so a summer planting afterwards, and that also the garden not only is there to be beautiful and admired, it also plays a role as partly as a kitchen garden. Other features we can use, for instance, are the beautiful floral decorations used within the palace. This is, for instance, the painting on the ceiling of our great hall. And if we enlarge part of it, we can see in detail that we have the variegated tulips. We have the large double roses. There is a hibiscus just underneath the rose and the tulip. We have a white peony. There are the narcissus. It's out of, I cannot see it myself at the moment, but I know it's there. So we can use all those different 17th century flower details in the interior also as a guideline. So when the museum opened in 1984, there was a special garden committee that looked on possible plants, following also all the steps as Lenneke showed us what was available. But we also know that this garden had a very special plant collection, and Willem and Mary were part of a large social international network that also exchanged material. So I also studied the Sloan Herbarium in the National History Museum and looked at the 17th century books. And there were 3 plants that were not in the original lists, for instance, that could be found. So here we have, I hope you can all recognize Leonotus leonurus, like lion's tail from the 17th century. Corydalis, it's called here Corydalis regulus. And you see, if you can see the whole sentence, you can see here you work also in the 17th century with pre-Linnaean names. I will talk about a little bit more about it in a few minutes. And this is another plant that showed up in all 17th century herbarium books, Cannabis sativa. So that was very special to see and probably used in the 17th century for medical purposes. So if we now look, for instance, to this Leonotus leonurus lion's tail, I already told you, you have to work a lot with pre-Linnaean plant names. So this one is very easily recognizable. So you can go to one of the taxonomical databases. I use, for instance, a lot the World Flora Online. And if we then go to Leonotus leonurus, we see almost at the bottom with the orange angle that this species was originally published by Linnaeus as Phlomis leonurus, and it can be found, Species Plantarum, page 587. So what I mostly do then is run to my very worn 2 volumes of Species Plantarum I have on my desk, because this contains a lot of information that's not available in most databases. So you might know, okay, Linnaeus he's very important for our binomial nomenclature, but he also did another special feat, because, like, for instance, if we go to page 587 of Species Plantarum, there we see this Phlomis leonurus with the description. But what Linnaeus also did is like saying, okay, I call this species Phlomis leonurus, and it's the same one that my predecessors also stated, like, okay, so he's saying it's the same one as that's mentioned in the Hortus Cliffortianus, and he gives the pre-Linnaean name that's given in the Hortus Cliffortianus. It says another pre-Linnaean name, and it's cited in, he says, Brine Sint, I will come back to them, or Morris Hist. And the Species Plantarum also have an index at the end of the second volume showing all the literature he used. So here we can say, he said, like, Brine Sint, so it's Jacob Brine in his Exoticarum Plantum Historium, and it's published in 1678. So meaning for me that, okay, so reconstructing to the end of the 17th century, this one is old enough, I can use this one. And the other one mentioned for lay notice was the Morris Histoire, so Robert Morrison's Plantarum Historiae, and that one is from 1680. So both saying that this plant would be old enough to be used in a 17th century garden. And I wanted to take the opportunity, knowing that there are so many people, so many of you out there from all over Europe, that I would like to share a dream project for the future. I mean, we bring together so much knowledge about the introduction of ornamental plants in historical gardens over different periods. Would it be possible somehow to start a shared database of available plants through time, connected to these things like the style, the age, and the creative artist? So I hope some of you out there will be willing to consider if it's possible to make a new project working on bringing so much of this knowledge together. Thank you for your attention.